Thank you for joining us today. I'm Luisa.
And I'm Maddison. Today we'll be explaining some of the root causes and challenges of the current migrant crisis in Costa Rica, where we're currently recording this podcast from at the University for Peace.
On September 27th, Costa Rica's president signed a decree saying that Costa Rica was in a state of emergency due to the migration crisis. We were both curious to understand why, with a long history of receiving people from Nicaragua, and we wondered what made this situation different for the country to enter such a state. That's why we chose this conflict as the one to analyze for this podcast.
So Latin America is a region where there have been many migration flows that have their origin in economic factors, so such as inequality, poverty, lack of unemployment, and a lack of opportunities for this integral development of people, as well as social factors like insecurity generated by organized crime and the maras, and political factors like repression, military dictatorships, and police brutality enforced by the state, which lead to forced displacement and additional issues, like we'll discuss with the current migrant crises in Venezuela and Nicaragua.
Costa Rica is no exception to this pattern. In the last 2 decades, the country has experienced different migration movements. It is a country with both internal and international migration. It receives migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, but it's also a migration corridor for a lot of people in transit that want to go to the north.
Yeah, actually, migrants represent around 11% of Costa Rica's population, with Nicaraguans accounting for 79% of the total immigration population. And let's not forget, this number is underreported, as many of these crossings are undocumented. So irregular immigrants on top of the 79% are estimated around 2 to 4% of all of Costa Rica's population. And in the last 2 decades, there has been a growing number of migrants from Colombia and Venezuela, as well as Africa, Haiti, and Cuba, and they're mainly en route to the United States. It's estimated that 9,600 migrants enter every month with the sole intention of crossing from the south to the north border.
So not staying in the country.
Exactly.
Okay. Migration in Costa Rica is a complex issue and has become one of the most tropical social phenomena in the country as a result of these trends. To start, we thought it was important to understand Costa Rica's strategic location as well as a little bit of its context.
So Costa Rica is a transit country. It's got a total of 15 border control posts, so 4 of which are airports, 6 are land, and 5 are sea. Costa Rica's northern border with Nicaragua is 313 kilometers long, while its southern border with Panama is 348 kilometers long. Unlike some of South and Central American countries, Costa Rica and Nicaragua share a long porous border, with its primary border crossing being Peñas Blancas.
What are porous borders?
Yes, so when I discuss porous borders, it means that there's a lot of illegal crossing and holes, so there are a lot of other ways to come through Nicaragua to Costa Rica illegally across the border.
Okay. Costa Rica's geographical location also favors different types of migration flows. Some are historical flows, others are more recent. And they have included both regular and irregular migrations throughout history. From January to September of this year alone, 386,000 migrants had already crossed the border. So the numbers have kept increasing from September till now, and for the rest of the year probably will.
Yeah, definitely. And there are some specific features of Costa Rica's migration context that do set the country aside from other countries in Central America. But first, let's discuss the parties and some of the root causes of these migration crises impacting Costa Rica.
Even though historically most migration flows have been south to north, there is also a registry of some south to south migrations between countries. For example, Bolivians and Peruvians to Chile or Paraguay to Argentina. And our first example is Nicaragua, who has the biggest south-to-south exile that has been registered in the last 2 decades. Between 1972 and the present, Nicaragua had different cycles of migration, and our interest begins with Costa Rica's period of modernization, coinciding with the political situation in Nicaragua nowadays.
Yeah, so we were interested in the significant shift in composition of characteristics of Nicaraguan migrants. So this shifted in around 2016 and 2018 from being primarily composed of low-skilled and low-wage workers to include more high-skilled individuals, so specifically journalists, as well as activists and other workers that are criticizing Ortega's regime or work for an organization that he's targeted or persecuted. On the topic of journalism, it's important to note the role of the media and political leaders in giving visibility to the Nicaraguan migration crisis and shaming the Ortega regime.
Mm.
And since we've seen this shift in composition of migrants, we've seen an increase as well of articles in the media discussing the freedom of expression in journalists and the need to protect Nicaraguan journalists. But prior to this, in 2016, we didn't see it as much with the need to protect Nicaraguan workers in low-wage and low-skilled jobs as much. So it's interesting.
During a recent visit to the Museo Nacional de Costa Rica, the National Museum in San Jose, we actually talked to the historian and curator Maddison and I, Gabriela Villalobos Madrigal, and I remember she confirmed that Nicaraguans have migrated to Costa Rica since as early as the 19th century.
Yeah.
And she said that in 1982, Nicaraguans made up the largest number of foreigners, and that's still accurate nowadays, which is crazy.
Exactly. And yeah, increasingly since 2016, and also due to that shift in composition of Nicaraguan migrants, some of the reasons for leaving have increased the direct threats via social media and targeting of activists and journalists. In 2018, Ortega also had this cleanup operation, which he named, which intensified a lot of his strategies for repression, which led to more crimes, grave human rights crimes committed. As well as arbitrary arrest and torture violations, which is obviously influencing the displacement in the region. One source that we actually discussed in our introduction to peace studies courses is the Global Peace Index, which basically quantifies peace.
Which we have here with us.
Thanks to the International Peace Institute. And we just wanted to share that out of the 163rd country surveyed, Nicaragua ranks 123rd. But sadly, due to that political situation in 2018 and 2020, we know as early as 2020 that 1 out of 10 Nicaraguans is forced to flee, and the number has probably gone up in the last few years.
Yeah, the problem in Costa Rica is that the asylum system and local communities, among other sectors, are feeling overwhelmed right now. 65,000 Nicaraguans actually requested asylum in 2018, and between September of last year and July of this year, those numbers reached 45,800 something people. And currently, Nicaraguans that leave the country are likely to be denied re-entry or suffer a lot of difficulties when trying to either leave the country or go back. I know you had some experience visiting the country not too long ago.
So I guess that's one of the great opportunities being in the country is we do have this ability to travel across the border. And so I crossed through the Peña de Blancas border by bus to visit Granada. And on the way there was a family of Costa Ricans, and the father was a dual citizen, so he had the Nicaraguan passport and the Costa Rican passport. And there was a lot of commotion surrounding his citizenship. So the border patrol agents, both at the Costa Rica border and then after at the Nicaraguan border, had separated the father from the family and spoken to him. And then within the bus, the mother and child, who were both Costa Rican, were also quite concerned. So it was sad to see that this fear and emotions were invoked in the issue, but there was a sense of community within the bus, which was really nice to see how other Nicaraguans and Costa Ricans in the bus kind of consoled her. Finally, we all did make it across to the Nicaraguan border, but I don't know if they're going to have any issues trying to get out or leave Nicaragua now.
You're coming back.
Yeah.
Well, moving on to the next country that we're going to study, we're going to talk about Venezuela.
Yeah.
It's also a part involved. As we mentioned at the beginning, on September 27th, Costa Rica's President Rodrigo Chavez declared the crisis of Venezuela's coming into Costa Rica. That's interesting because exactly the state of emergency is about Venezuelans crossing through the country, but not so much as Nicaraguans being here. So why has it become a crisis?
Exactly. And they're both impacting Costa Rica. So why is it only one and not both being labeled a crisis or state of emergency?
Yeah.
Also, this past September, the president of the National Emergency Commission, so the CNE, you had President Alejandro Picado, who stated that the Costa Rica had received 386,000 migrants so far this year, with the vast majority crossing through the Panama-Costa Rica border town of Panama-Costa Rica border.
Paso Canoas, I think is the name.
Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
So yeah, Venezuelan migrants are overwhelming the resources at the border for Costa Rica and Panama.
Okay. I wanted to mention super quickly before going all the way to Venezuela, the Darien Gap, because the more I researched, and I think you as well, we researched the problem, we found Venezuelans coming into the country, the importance of mentioning this gap where migrants must cross before arriving to Costa Rica. It's one of the world's most dangerous migration routes. It's in the jungle, it connects Panama and Colombia. It has no roads whatsoever, there's no plans to create roads, so it's just jungle. The terrain is very difficult, and there's high risk about crossing it. It's unpoliced, and there's a lot of rebel groups and drug criminals. So
No, it's extremely dangerous. And Panama estimated that over 420,000 migrants have crossed the gap from Colombia to Panama already this year. So it makes it likely also that by the end of the year, that full number is definitely going to top the 500,000. And then as well, the Panama government did report that 71% of those crossing into Costa Rica through the shared border, 71% were Venezuelan.
Okay.
Another thing to recognize when we're speaking about the Darien Gap and some of the roots of migration and conflicts is that it is gendered. So women and children crossing the Darien Gap are going to face much higher levels of violence, specifically gender and sexual-based violence, which requires robust psychosocial support and accountability for the crimes, which we'll discuss a little later in our recommendations. But I know you also have a little bit of experience with some of the gendered elements to conflicts and migration.
Yeah, I know when talking specifically about Mexico, the reality is quite similar. Actually, most women that are going to cross through Mexico to get all the way to the United States start taking contraception because they are expecting some sexual violence to happen. And that's the crazy part, that they know it's coming and it's going to happen at some point along the way.
Yeah.
Getting back to Costa Rica, there was a mobility study conducted by the IOM in 2021. And it reported that 96% of all the people entering Costa Rica are planning to just use it as a transit country. So 96% of the people actually don't want to stay here. 79% plan to go all the way into the United States. 16% want to stay in Mexico. And 4% of them want to travel all the way to Canada.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
And we will get into some of these other pathways and host countries in our recommendations.
Yeah.
Specifically, what happened a couple of days ago, just to wrap up on Venezuela, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and others expressed concern this week at the escalating tensions between Guyana and Venezuela, which undoubtedly will lead to more migrants leaving and as well exacerbate the impact on Costa Rica and the Panama border.
Yeah. So, how have these migration waves affected Costa Rica? Why do we think it's considered a crisis? One of the most important aspects to support and integrate the migration population has to do with building relationships, social harmony, and inclusion in Costa Rica. It's important to analyze impressions that exist within the country and its society regarding the migrant population residing in the country. In social terms, one of the main challenges that I think that needs to be overcome is that Costa Rican society continues to view migrants in light of myths and stereotypes that influence all native-born populations' perceptions of them. I was actually in Costa Rica with a Costa Rican family this weekend, and I was surprised when I told them that we were going to do this podcast and we were going to talk about the crisis. They were like, "All right, the Nicaraguans in the country." And it's like, well, no. How can you, the stereotype that exists of all immigrants are Nicaraguans, or not even recognizing all the Venezuelans coming through. So it was interesting too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also just being in Costa Rica does allow us to get up close and interview a lot of Ticos. So I had a bit of a different experience where they did differentiate between Nicaraguan and Venezuelan migrants, but also were discussing the Nicaraguans more negatively and how they were impacting their services and their health system specifically. So there was very much a very, I think, negative perception of Nicaraguan migrants coming from what I've experienced.
Yeah.
There is the structural dependence as well for Nicaraguans on Costa Rica job opportunities. And this perception of migrants coming to take jobs is also very apparent in other contexts. When we look at the US, this is also the narrative. And so, just to mention that.
I actually want to debunk some of these ideas.
Yes.
Immigrants residing in Costa Rica actually contribute significantly to the country's labor force and economy. They represent about 16% of all labor markets, and the report published in 2018 by the OECD and ILO states that resident migrants make a very positive contribution to economic growth, more precisely around 11 and 12% of value added and 12% of the country's GDP.
Yeah, and also Gatica Lopez, so from IOM Costa Rica, found that the heads of migrant households and the migrant labor force in general make significant contributions to the country's social security systems. This is based on data from 2011 now, but the National Population and Housing Census showed that resident immigrants contribute to an average of 26% to Social Security, as compared to only 22.3% of native-born Costa Ricans. So in other words, migrants contribute relatively more to CCSS, Costa Rica's Social Security, than Costa Rican-born population. So it's really worth noting that the data shows that immigrants are not a burden for the country at all, but on the contrary, they're contributing to social and economic development of Costa Rica, sometimes even more than Costa Ricans are. So debunks a lot of our myths.
Yeah, I know the Inter-American Dialogue said that Nicaraguans that arrived before 2018, like the ones that arrived before, 70% of them had access to the Caja Costarricense, which is the social security system that we just mentioned. And after 2018, only 29% of the people that arrived had access to it. And actually, in November 2022, President Rodrigo Chavez stated that the country was spending around $300 million every year to help immigrants and asylum seekers, something that is draining the resources of the health and education sector, and the aid that is given by international agencies is not enough. But as we've seen, the things that the immigrants have brought into the country, like we need to talk about the economic crisis that Costa Rica is living as its own, and not only like separated from the immigrant crisis.
Yeah, they're two separate problems, and the economic crisis can't be blamed on the migrants coming to Costa Rica. So yeah, we want to make that definitely clear. And then we can talk a little bit about education as well. So in Costa Rica, education is free, and there is access for immigrants, even though they can't all go to school. So specifically ACNUR, so UNHCR, has followed cases of violence and discrimination against asylum-seeking children within schools. There are challenges that exist in accessing school without the proper documentation, but we did find statistics that noted 40% of immigrant children in Costa Rica that don't have legal immigration status or documentation still have access to school. So we were happy to see this.
Yeah. During the data collection stage of our research, we conducted some interviews with Nicaraguans living in Costa Rica, who we won't name for ethical and security reasons, but we confirmed that social discrimination between Costa Rican and Nicaraguans. According to some Nicaraguans' perception, Costa Rica's labor market was not prepared to absorb profiles of people with higher education, as we saw in the switch of
the composition switch in 2016 and 2018.
Yeah, so people looking to get into higher salary jobs or other labor options were offered lower quality jobs than the ones that they were used to.
Yeah. And the asylum seekers that are part of this sector of the population are also affected by these exclusive narratives from Costa Rican nationals. So they're not attributed characteristics from other Nicaraguans, such as the accent or the physical experience. And through our interviews, I think we uncovered a lot of this, that Nicaraguans were extremely discriminated against in public spaces, such as public transport, and even just community parks and on the street. So compared to native-born population, immigrants of Nicaraguan origin that are residing permanently in Costa Rica do face more difficulties in terms of social inclusion, which is expressed in all indicators of housing, education, work, health, income distribution, and poverty.
Actually, when we went to the National Museum a couple of weeks ago, we learned how most mestizo, Black, and indigenous population in the country had been erased for history alone, and that there's a weird whiteness idea that exists within the country. I think this explains a lot of the anti-immigration attitudes and violence that exists within Costa Rica.
Yeah, and based specifically on the research from 2018 to present, we've seen an increase.
Yeah.
So just to note, the discrimination and attitudes are not getting better, they're actually getting worse. So let's move on now to discuss some of our research approaches and methodology. Now that we have explained some of the political history and analyzed these conflicts in Costa Rica and the migrant crises, we'd like to share some of the models of analysis that we did employ before we discuss our current programs and responses and some of the recommendations we have to move forward in a more positive and sustainable way. Yeah. First off, we need to thank our Professor Amar Abdallah, as we did employ his model of CRT-CPABIO to approach our conflict analysis. We also utilized the Spitz-Rowe framework to analyze some of the micro-level factors, which we did learn from Adriana Salcido and during our foundations course with Dr. Abdallah.
Yeah, some of the theories and key thinkers that we included in our research was Lazarak's theory of change about peace building as a long-term transformation of a war system into a peace system. We looked into Oliver Ramsbotham theory to understand violent conflict and how it includes like prevention, management, and the transformation of a conflict, as well as learned for identity types of intervention.
Yep. So we also then discussed a lot throughout our research and just analyzing what recommendations will work with the concept of the liberal peace building theory, which we've employed and used a couple of times now throughout our courses at the University for Peace. We'd like to thank Adriana Salcido also for introducing us to this concept of liberal peace building from a very critical lens. The role of the US in shaping the political landscape of Central America is important because a lot of their interventions in the past, especially in the 90s, contributed to a lot of the political instability that we see today. Even today, if you look at the United Nations peacekeeping website, if you look for ONUCA, you'll still see that it's described as one of the most complex and successful interventions the United Nations has taken within peacekeeping and peacemaking efforts in Central America in 1989. So the U.S. has intervened historically in Central America, driven by economic, political, strategic interests, their own political agenda. But just to note that liberal peace building historically contributes to a very Western security-centric approach in regions and does affect countries' developments. And it has undoubtedly influenced some of these crises that we're discussing today.
We also, part of the methodology, we interviewed Nicaraguans, which we already mentioned, currently being persecuted or unable to return and affected by President Ortega's policies. As we've mentioned, we also spoke to some Costa Ricans to understand their attitudes towards Nicaraguans in Costa Rica. We discussed current activities and programs with a fellow UP student that works for the UNHCR, and he told us about the programs they're implementing, such as financing buses that help people transport across the border, shelters, and other basic human needs programs that exist. And it's important to mention like the ethical, moral consideration that we did decide to leave out some of our findings that could contribute to increased risk to some of the people that we talked to. And our research was guided by understanding the complexities of why Nicaraguans are migrating south and Venezuelans are going all the way north, with the focus on ways forward, specifically talking about Costa Rica.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on, I guess, then to some of the current programs, responses, and initiatives that are being used to mitigate the crises. So there are a few programs being implemented currently. So we do have the National Integration Plan and others that are addressing the current crises, among which programs include partnerships with international actors and the Costa Rican government, Panamanian government, the IOM, UNHCR, and different NGOs and international actors.
First, we'll mention the National Action Plan. It was they just rewrote it, so it's 2023-2027. And the Costa Rican state says that to assume the situation with the migration population is not to resolve a problem, but to construct a better world, specifically throughout the development of strategic intersectional alliances with state logic. So it was an interesting paper to look at, like what they are proposing. And if you're interested, I would really recommend going into the National Action Plan that Costa Rica has in place.
Yeah.
In August of this year, an organ of the legislative power of Costa Rica called the Defense of Inhabitants actually emitted 16 recommendations to deal with the humanitarian migration crisis. Some of the things that it included was the creation of more shelters in the borders, as well as the maintenance and how they are being cleaned, the creation of a mechanism that can allow daily registration of the people crossing to recognize their protection. This is hard considering like all illegal or irregular immigrants coming through, and other mechanisms and alternatives in general for the transportation of people from the southern to the northern border, among other things.
Yeah. And even though most Venezuelans, as we saw before, are looking all the way to go to the United States, some do stay. So currently, there is a project that's being implemented by the IOM, and it's financed by the U.S. Department of State of Migration, called the 800 Venezuela Project. So 800 Venezuela aims to bring assistance to Venezuelans living in Costa Rica and accompany them in integral ways to adapt to the country and consider their needs. Among them, psychosocial attention, which I actually discussed in a presentation on reconciliation. So Cambodia is a good example of addressing the psychosocial needs following conflict through different programs that look at strengthening the emotional capacity of individuals affected. And this is a main aim of the program because it's believed that they can accompany them in a more integral way so that they don't become a burden for the country and a crisis for the healthcare system. But there needs to be psychosocial support and it needs to be worked into these emergency aid programs. Overall, the objective of the 800 Venezuela program is to enhance the capacity of the Ministry of Health and continue the development.
We also listened to a press conference that a past president of Costa Rica, Luis Guillermo Solís, gave in 2016 in the Wilson Center in the US. And he talked about migration crisis as a transit one. He was actually the first person in Costa Rica to talk about it as a transit crisis, since they had received a big group of Haitians that were traveling from the US, from Brazil all the way to the US. And he mentioned that they had, as a way to protect the migrants, created a law of 25 days of freedom of movement within the country, where immigrants would not be persecuted by local authorities in these 25 days, like first 25 days. And it was safer for immigrants because they did not have to pay for coyotes.
Yeah.
I had never heard of a policy like this, and I think it would be very useful for Mexico, considering all the violence they live, but I don't know if it's still used or not because I could not find the information.
I agree. We can definitely draw out some lessons learned from this specific 25 days of freedom of movement law, and it's definitely interesting to bring it to other cases.
Yeah. Also, well, connecting to our context, I know that Mexico, they had a reunion last month, and there were representatives from 11 Latin American countries, and someone from Costa Rica was there. And it was about talking, like, their plan to implement migration policies to protect the human rights of all the migrants and to keep the dignity of migrating people and their families. They talked about the selective measures that the US has, how they offer asylum to some countries like Cuba and Venezuela, but do massive deportations about other countries. And it was interesting because what they talked about in Mexico was about hoping to create a south-to-south cooperation to promote dialogue between origins and transit countries for immigrants, so like Central American, Latin Americans getting together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think also as a Canadian, it's interesting to look at what can be done across the Americas. I know specifically in Venezuela, the position of the Canadian government is to promote a peaceful return to democracy for Venezuela. They do publicly shame the current human rights violation and crimes against humanity driven by the ongoing political, economic, and humanitarian crises. So there's a lot of naming and shaming involved. Canada also did launch a new humanitarian migration pathway for Colombians, which was I was happy to read, but once digging a little bit further into it, I noticed that only 11,000 migrants were being let in, which isn't nearly enough. And there was also this clause that the applicants from Colombia, Haiti, or Venezuela needed to be affiliated with a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident who agrees to support them and their family for the first year of Canadian residency. So unfortunately, I don't think this is actually helping the current situation. There is specifically a program for Nicaraguans that I did find as well, but it's called the Express Entry Points Program. So basically the highest ranking individuals that apply for the Express Entry Pool are selected, and you gain points based on your skills, level of education, language ability, and work experience, as well as if you're married, if you're bringing dependents. So it was disappointing to see that there wasn't more being done currently, but hopefully it's on the way and just being held up by the bureaucratic structures.
Yeah, I feel like I've heard people, maybe not from Venezuela, but a person from Puerto Rico told me that they went into the express entry system to see like how many points they could get, and I found that very interesting. Like, yeah. Anyways,
it's disappointing.
Yeah. Before closing this podcast, we would like to give some recommendations and some positive news. As we saw in Adriana Salcedo's class in Introduction to Peace Studies, conflicts aren't linear. There's a cookie-cutter approach, and each conflict should be taken by its context. And we do want to mention some recommendations. This is by no means an exhaustive list. But
yeah, I love how you include the no cookie-cutter approach, because there really is no panacea for a migration crisis, but there are lessons learned that could be applied to other contexts. Specifically, I know one of the recommendations we've talked about is inclusive diplomacy, so ways to facilitate dialogue and mediation processes with actors involved. So some of them would be the Nicaraguan government, Venezuelan government, Costa Rican government, Panamanian government, and other stakeholders involved that are well positioned to either provide resources, financial assistance, or even host migrants in their countries as well. Stronger partnerships with UN agencies as well as policymakers, civil society, among other levels of actors, will really help contribute to some of the more collaborative efforts among these entities, and are important also to change, I think, the social perception and reception of migrants in Costa Rica.
Mm.
Also, just to mention, Canada, as a privileged and rich country in the Americas, has profited off of U.S. economic endeavors and exploitations in Central America, and I strongly believe has the responsibility to respond and provide aid for migrants transiting. There needs to be more than only 4% of Nicaraguans going to Canada. We have the space, and there's no reason that we can't figure out new pathways and programs to help mitigate this migration crisis in Costa Rica.
Yeah. Some of the other recommendations that Maddison and I were talking about was democracy and governance reforms. Probably the most difficult one of our recommendations, and most radical, but probably a necessary recommendation to say nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about curbing the Darien Gap route completely through regional cooperation with governments, international community, and civil society. We know that also a safety ignore, the Darien route is not within Costa Rica, but how can we develop a safe and better pathway for immigrants that are getting here? Mentioned humanitarian assistance, mostly Nicaragua, and how it requires cooperation with the Ortega government, and he must, I don't know if we can ask him, but he should be allowing some international organizations and aid and other programs to exist within the country.
Unfortunately, some of our recommendations do seem maybe a little bit radical, or that they will just be tabled right away. But we need to address the root causes, and the root cause, and specifically in Nicaragua, is that Ortega has to go, and there needs to be a peaceful return to political stability.
And it's part of these, like, how other countries have our responsibility to, address the situation that's going on.
Definitely. I think the international community has to uphold a lot of these international laws, soft or not, and really just the Americas as a whole as well needs to cooperate as one in a coordinated effort.
Yeah, this dialogue that needs to happen, right, between stakeholders, the governments, the international community, all that we've just mentioned, to respond to the root causes.
Mm-hmm. And Costa Rica clearly has a solid institutional framework to assist the migrant population, but the assistance is also financially dependent on international cooperation and agencies. To ensure that the policies are properly implemented, we need the effective communication and dialogue between parties, and we need the outreach programs. But for these programs, we need financing. So.
I think those are mostly the recommendations we came through. We talked about that we thought that we wanted to point out in our podcast. Sorry, lost the word for a second.
So I guess thank you all so much for joining us today. We were really happy to get to analyze the conflict a little more in depth, being in Costa Rica, and really see what pathways exist, what programs and activities are being done.
And please feel free to reach us at the university or a University for Peace if you want to hear more about this.
Thank you.
Thank you.